Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to our webinar on consequences and interventions for school refusal students. Many of you have requested that we do a follow-up webinar on this topic, at times feeling understandably unsure of how to best approach consequences in school refusal cases. To that end, I'm hoping that you'll find this presentation to be insightful as well as practical when dealing with this increasingly common issue. Additionally, we'll also be making this recording and the slides available on our website, www.sageday.com, as of tomorrow morning. Hi everyone, my name is Zack Schwartz, Director of In-District Programs with SageDay. This is a service that was designed by SageDay as a means to fill the gap in service between traditional in-school support and an out-of-district placement. I'll discuss this more in depth a little later in our presentation. But to give you some more background on SageDay schools, we're a fully accredited private NABLES placement school. We are also the only therapeutic school that requires 3 different modalities of therapy integrated into the school day, those being individual, group, and family therapy. We're proud to offer 3 campuses as well: SageDay Rochelle Park High School, SageDay Boonton High School, and SageDay Mahwah Lower and Middle School. At all of our schools, it's important to us that we combine strong academics based on the Common Core standards with a small personalized environment that prepares students for success. Additionally, as another means to offer more comprehensive information about the work that we do at SageDay, we are also pleased to announce the recent completion of our first book, Sage Advice for Educators and Professionals. This book is a compilation of all of our Q&As as well as our Sage Advice articles, which provide deep insight into how we transform the lives of many students through therapeutic education. We will be sending out an email within the next few weeks containing more information about how people can get a hold of this new book. And for more general information about SageDay, please visit our website at www.sageday.com. Before we get started, I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and I do stress the word participation because these presentations are really most effective when you make it a point to raise the questions that have been stirring around in your mind. We'll have a Q&A portion at the end of this webinar, but of course, feel free to type in your questions at any time in the chat box so that we can make sure to address them later on. Okay, now let's get started here. In today's presentation, we'll be discussing, first off, the definition of school refusal behavior, just as a bit of a refresher from the last webinar. Then we'll get into the 2 types of school refusal, those being emotional and behavioral SRB. From there, we'll talk about the foundation and application of SRB interventions. And then we'll get into how to determine and administer consequences for SRB. And that gets broken down into home-driven consequences, which are administered by the parents, and then school-driven consequences, which are the ones handled by the school district. And then lastly, we'll provide a general understanding about roles for school personnel, child, family, and providers in dealing with SRB situations. Okay, so what is school refusal? So essentially, school refusal behavior encompasses a continuum of school avoidant behaviors ranging from, most significantly, chronic and complete refusal to go to school, and to a somewhat lesser degree, some difficulties related to ongoing tardiness or to remaining at school after arrival. And then lastly, in situations where the student can make it to school and actually stay in the building, there can still be a pattern of difficulties in attending the actual classes. So within school refusal, I wanted to talk briefly about the form and function of it, which was also discussed in the last webinar. So just as a review here, the form, what essentially that means is, how does the school refusal behavior manifest? Is it total day, arriving late, leaving early, or is it in the form of psychosomatic symptoms? Are there some issues like a headache or stomach ache that's manifesting in a bodily form in which there's a psychological underlying issue there? And in terms of the function, we want to know, why is the student engaging in school refusal behavior? So is it for positive reasons, like to get to stay home with mom or watch TV, things like that? Or might it even be just to miss school, or to be out with some friends that are either older or just don't go to school anymore? Or is it the negative type of function, which relates to the child that's really afraid to go to school, that is just so anxious and has these unrealistic fears about what might happen during the course of the school day? These are the ones who are just trying to avoid the pain associated with going to school, versus the behavioral ones who may be just trying to gain pleasure by not going to school. And then also, at what point from the perspective of a school district would it actually be considered school refusal behavior? And that would be in the sense of, Is it impacting the child's social, emotional, and academic functioning? And also, of course, the attendance policy. And I think it's really just a good rule of thumb that if you find yourself having to ask the question, is this child that I'm seeing here exhibiting school refusal behavior? If you're having to ask that question, then you probably do know the answer. It's probably SRB. So, in thinking about school refusal, it really is such a unique topic in the sense that the mere act of just being absent from school or missing a class or two on a particular day can appear totally harmless, and often it is for most students. But when it starts to snowball for that small segment of the population, this process of accumulating absences or tardies can very quickly turn into SRB and into something which can become psychiatrically quite concerning. Okay, so as I alluded to earlier, there are, I'll say, two types of school refusal behavior. We have this nice little Venn diagram here to show those to you. It's really the emotional SRB versus the behavioral SRB. And as you can see, it's not always so strictly compartmentalized or dichotomous. There's often a lot of overlap. But just to give you some sense about which might be the predominant type, I've listed out some feelings and descriptors to try and differentiate the two. The emotional type, I'd say that's the more common type that we're really dealing with today. Although the webinar will touch on both, I think a lot of people tend to be experiencing children and adolescents with the more emotional type of school refusal behavior lately. And these are the children that are significantly presenting with some intense anxiety. Additionally, there can be a lot of guilt or shame there with them too. These are kids that are actually feeling very badly about not being able to make it to school, to the point that they can get very tearful and upset about it. There could also be a real sadness or hopelessness for them as well. The opposite end of the spectrum is the behavioral type. These are the kids that, at least consciously, are not all that concerned about not being in school. They don't have this intense anxiety about it. It's more of an apathy, a not caring, and they don't feel a ton of shame about it either. They're not really worried about what's going to happen to them if they miss school. And conversely, at times, they can be a little provocative or brazen. In some ways, kind of trying to show off and say, listen, I'm not going to go to school, and what are you going to do about it? But ultimately, I do think there are some common feelings between the emotional and behavioral types. And that would be what we see here in the middle. I think both types of children are feeling quite disconnected. And I do think they're feeling a sense of loneliness, at least on a deeper level. And clearly there's some frustration for them as well, whether it's the emotional or the behavioral type. And then there's also certainly a defiant piece, but that would be more overt with the behavioral child. The emotional child could be somewhat more passive-aggressive and more defiant in sort of subtle ways, but it still ends up being a form of defiance. And lastly here, a sense of powerlessness. And it's pretty obvious for the emotional kid that's feeling this lack of power and can't get themselves out the door or into the classroom. But with the behavioral ones, in some ways it might seem like they're feeling totally powerful in the sense that they don't feel like they have to do what anyone says. But I would actually counter that if they're having to go this far to really show this sense of power, to say I can do whatever I want and not go to school, I do think in some ways that's probably a real compensation for feeling very powerless underneath. And this is really just the opposite way for them to try and express that. Okay, so recently I had a case manager contacting me, asking me about how to approach interventions for school refusal cases. As we all know, they can have some nuances to them and seem a little bit tricky at times. So to clear things up, I wanted to get into the basic foundation and application of SRB interventions, and then go through them here one by one to make sure that they're being employed in an incremental sort of way at some point during the process. The first thing that we really want to do is make it as easy as possible for a child to get to school, which I know sounds pretty obvious, but the ways in which we can really do that, depending on how your school district is set up, may vary a little bit. You may have a discrete or a side door entrance in the school in which the student can go in that way. There might also be a place other than the classroom too, where we can have the student stay initially that can make them feel a little more comfortable. In the cases of schools within district programs, they can go to the in-district therapist's office. But if you don't have that, but have some other therapeutic resources, like the Child Study Team office, Student Assistance Counselor office, Guidance office, or even a nurse's office, those can all be really safe places for the student to go as well. So the next intervention would be helping the child develop a step-by-step plan. And what I mean by that is really checking in with the child and talking with them about how the school day is going to go. The whole idea of going to school can feel really overwhelming for some of these children, but if we can break it down step by step, like here's where you're going to go period 1, here's what you can do during period 2, then we can give them some options and walk them through the whole day. Not to mention, this can give them some control in the process too, because if they can feel some control, then that can also reduce some anxiety as well. Rather than having them arrive at school and just saying, well, you're here now, let's make it work. The more we can break it down in advance, the more manageable it can feel. So the next one would be anticipating and discussing potential school refusal issues each night before going to bed. And of course, once the child is at school too. But the piece about doing it at night, that's something the parents can do, and we can help them out with that. We don't want it to get to the point of the child waking up in the morning with everyone being so reactive, trying to come up with a plan in that moment, while everything else is going on frantically that morning. So the night before, just to give a case example here, one time I was working with a student, and she fell more into the anxious realm of the school refusal student, and also had some obsessive compulsive traits. And in the morning, she had a hard time getting to school for a lot of reasons. But she would often take very long showers in the morning, and her parents were always yelling at her to hurry up. But it wouldn't matter. She would just ruminate and spend so much time in the shower that it was really impacting her ability to get to school on time, and also causing more conflict in the home. And on top of that, once she got out of the shower, she had a hard time making decisions about what to wear, which would kill even more time and make her even later to school. So one of the things we did, which might not exactly seem like rocket science here, is that we talked about the idea of taking a shower and picking out her clothes the night before. And when we mentioned it to her, something that we thought could be helpful, I don't know if it was something that she just hadn't thought of, or if she just needed to hear someone else say it, but it instantly gave her some degree of relief. And once we started doing that, it really made a difference. And again, there are lots of ways to plan for the night before, and every child is going to be different. But anything we can do to alleviate some symptoms in the morning will just make it a little bit easier for the child, and really for everyone. Of course, the real issue with this child wasn't showers and figuring out her wardrobe. Again, those were symptoms. And the more we could reduce them, the closer we could get to dealing with some of the underlying issues, which in her case ended up being some unrealistic fears about how she was viewed by her peers, as well as these distorted perfectionistic expectations of herself that she had actually projected onto her teachers. Moving along here, another intervention would be to enlist the parents or child to contact the child's friend to go to school together. I know the slide says if applicable, but I do think that most children with school refusal do have some friendships. You know, sometimes they don't, of course. But if they do, and depending on the size of the school district, if the students can walk to school together or carpool to school together, it can help the anxious child get to school in a way that can feel more comfortable. It also taps into the age-old idea of strength in numbers. When the child can actually enter the school doors with someone that feels comfortable with them, that has been with them through the whole process from leaving the home all the way up to arriving at school, that can be a really big support. All right, this next one is really important, and now we're starting to get into the meat of this. Calling the home every day that the child is tardy or absent. I know that it can seem like a lot to do, but again, I do think it's vitally important, because we do need to be invested in this process, and also to find out from the families what's really going on. Because sometimes, for various reasons, they might be ashamed or embarrassed to call us, or they might be forgetting it because they're so wrapped up in this situation. But calling the home just gives us a chance to really monitor what's going on each day. And again, kind of puts the pedal to the metal in terms of letting the family know that we're in this together and we're going to be on top of this with you at all times. The next level would be really doing a home visit, whether it's with or without additional school personnel. Now, in this day and age with more liability concerns, sometimes it's better for two school personnel to go to the home at the same time, but of course, each district may handle this differently. And while it can be good for liability reasons to not be in the home by yourself, it can also have some clinical benefits too, particularly if you're the child study team, SAC, or in-district therapist, and you're going to the home with, say, an administrator. More than likely, the child's not going to be wanting to spend too much time with the principal or vice principal in their home. So a lot of times by having two personnel go, the administrator can talk calmly with the parents about it, as well as gently reiterate the ramifications of the child not being at school, whereas the more clinical person at the home can do kind of an ad hoc therapy session with the child and really try to facilitate getting them to talk a little more openly than they would have in the presence of their parents or an administrator. But again, these home visits are good to do. Not necessarily the first time the child is obviously tardy or absent, but once you're beginning to see a pattern or a real escalation in SRB. Because if the child is not going to come from their home to the school, then we need to bring the school to the home. Okay, another intervention would be supporting the parents and consulting the child's pediatrician. And you might ask, why the pediatrician? Well, that kind of goes with the idea of the function of SRB as it relates to psychosomatic school refusal. A lot of times, and I've made this mistake myself, we see some psychosomatic symptoms manifesting with a child. And one time, being this brilliant therapist that I was, speaking sarcastically, I was very clear that the child's stomach ache was a psychosomatic issue and tried to delicately point it out to him. And then he said, no, I have a stomach ache. There's something wrong with me. It has nothing to do with my anxiety. And I kind of learned the hard way about this, and I'm glad that I did. Because anytime a child is initially manifesting with a physical symptom, the first thing that you might want to do is go to the pediatrician to rule out that it's not a medical issue, because there is always that possibility. And again, even if it's not strictly a medical issue, but you first treat it as a medical issue, the child is going to feel like you listened to them, that you cared about them, and are taking them more seriously about it. So then if the pediatrician does clear the child, at that point we've ruled out that it's not a medical issue and can then proceed a little more clinically. So again, it shows a sense of caring and empathy, and it also helps to ensure that we know that we're really dealing with. So assuming it's not a medical issue and the child is involved with a psychiatrist, one of the things that we want to do is be in touch with the psychiatrist and see if they might want to prescribe a PRN medication for the child. Something to take the edge off or reduce the anxiety in the morning, which can have an actual medicinal effect. And then the other reason that I can think that this can be helpful too is that there can be a placebo effect in which the child now believes that they have a medication that they can take to calm themselves. And this might just be calming in and of itself. Now this next one is something that we're going to get into in a little bit, and that would be to empower the parents to set and enforce consistent consequences for school refusal. Like I said, we'll get to that in a little bit in a more detailed way, and it's a pretty important piece that I know people may have lots of different feelings about. But until we delve into it, the next intervention would be conducting a meeting at school with a variety of school personnel, as well as the child's family and providers. And just a little anecdote here that makes for a good webinar, but I will say is not always the case. There was this one adolescent that I had been working with for some time, and when I say I mean we were all working with this child. And he was really only intermittently going to school, usually missing a couple days a week or showing up late to school a few days a week. And then it got to be about halfway through the school year. And at that point, we decided we're going to have a big meeting, a big multidisciplinary meeting with everyone from the principal to child study team to the nurse, special ed teacher, guidance, myself, the family, anyone that had any affiliation with this child. We were going to bring them to the table to have a meeting to talk about this student's struggles. And I don't really know what magic happened at this meeting, but I can tell you this. After this meeting, which I think was around February during the school year, this child only missed 3 days of school the rest of the year. And in only the previous week or two, he had missed at least 3 days of school, with some tardies sprinkled in there as well. And I actually tried to process with this child what it was about that meeting that really helped him get to school. And I don't think that he was able to consciously identify it, and in some ways, neither was I. And sure, ultimately, the most important thing was that he was getting to school. But I'm a therapist, so, of course, I need to have a few theories, right? One of them being that the child saw these people at the table who really were caring about him, which I think was an experience he wasn't used to really having. Another perspective is that I think was possible is that this meeting was quite uncomfortable for him at times, and he knew that if he kept going to school, he wouldn't need to have another one of these meetings. And I guess the last piece, too, is that it obviously showed a sense of seriousness about the level of this issue, and that we needed to have this many people at a meeting to talk about the SRB issue. So, I think it might have been one or more of these things, and I'm sure there are other reasons that people can come up with as well. But overall, I think it really just conveyed that, We want to work with you, the child. We're here for you. We're not ignoring this, and we need to be in this together. And again, in this situation, the child responded quite positively, and I think the parents felt very supported too. So if you've incrementally tried a bunch of these interventions and the SRB is not really improving, then we want to think about scheduling an intake for a partial hospitalization program or an intensive outpatient program. Because if we've tried all these interventions and they don't seem to be working, this may be an indicator that the child is emotionally struggling to the point that he or she needs a higher level of care. And then, at the very least, by setting up an intake appointment, sometimes just setting it up will help the child appreciate the significance of the situation and then might realize that they can pull it together and don't quite need a higher level of care. And at other times, it is the appropriate course of action, and the child does need that level of care. So one way or another, the child will always continue to get some form of treatment and see people continually taking steps to evaluate what kind of help is really needed. One of the last interventions to consider here is sending a truancy officer. Again, I mentioned earlier that we're focusing a little more on the emotional type of SRB in this webinar, but the truancy officer, I would say that's something that you want to use a little earlier in the process for the behavioral type of school refusal student, because this type of child might not be that interested in processing their situation therapeutically, and their SRB might not feel very anxiety-provoking to them. So they're probably not going to feel really compelled to want to go to school unless there are maybe some more serious ramifications, like a truancy officer. So putting that out there might just facilitate the process for the behavioral type of child in getting to school. And then sometimes people might question me too and say, would you ever use a truancy officer for an emotionally fragile child? And the short answer is yes, depending on the situation, but really just as a last resort. Because whether the child is emotional school refusal, behavioral school refusal, or combined, the child is still not going to school and still has a responsibility to be there, unless some other formal understanding has been agreed upon. And I truly believe that deep down, almost anything we can do to facilitate the child getting into the school building will likely have a greater therapeutic benefit than just being at home. Again, I wouldn't just bring a truancy officer on an emotionally delicate school refusal kid, but at some point, that might be a route that needs to be considered. Okay, getting into consequences. Consequences are kind of an interesting thing in the fact that they can be a little tricky and polarizing at times, particularly when people are concerned about the fragility of the child, as well as for various other reasons. But I think that if you select the right types of consequences and, more importantly, implement them consistently, they can be quite appropriate and pretty effective. So I wanted to get into a little bit about how to determine and administer consequences for school refusal behavior. And I wanted to start off first with the home-driven consequences. Excuse me. And these are the consequences that could typically be administered by the parents. So the question here would be, when should a parent be encouraged to administer consequences for school refusal behavior? And I guess the short answer here is that you really could do it at any time, particularly with the behavioral type of school refusal kid. But for those people that are a little apprehensive or don't want to start off with consequences, the point that I would say when it's essential to do is once the therapeutic interventions have been consistently tried in coordination with the school and the pattern of school refusal behavior persists. Because at that point, in my sense, something more and something new needs to be done here. So then we get the question of, how do you determine what the appropriate consequences are for school refusal? And I like to think of it in terms of this idea of 5 M's, just something to think about as a reference when you're figuring out the consequences. Now, first off, we want the consequences to be momentary. When I say momentary, what I really mean is for them to be daily or short-term. We don't want them to be too long-term, because school refusal is really a daily struggle for these kids, and there's typically not a lot of motivation for them out there in the future. Next, we also want them to be measurable. And what I mean by this is that it can't be just some vague nebulous consequence, whereas if the mom is home one day administering the consequence and she tells dad about it and he's not exactly sure how to administer it, then it's not going to be particularly measurable. So one way to protect against this is to write the consequence down, which can be a good way to ensure that it's measurable and clear. And I'll get into some examples that incorporate the 5 M's in a little bit as well. The next M would be meaningful. And what I mean by that is that it has to be something that is meaningful to the child, that they're going to have to be affected by it. Because what one child might respond to, another one won't. So we may have to figure it out by learning about the child or learning about the family, about what's going to be meaningful or an impactful consequence there. Okay, monitorable. This one is also key. And we have to make sure that the parents or whoever is monitoring the consequence has an actual means to be sure that it's being followed through with. Again, I'll get into some examples, but just for something like a situation with both parents are away from the home and they tell the child that he can't watch TV while he's home that day, that's not typically something that the parents can easily monitor. And the last M here is maintainable. And I mean that in two ways. As we alluded to earlier, consequences need to be consistent on an ongoing basis. So first, are you able to maintain them with some consistency? And I also mean maintainable in terms of, is the parent emotionally comfortable in maintaining the consequences? As we said, some people can be a bit apprehensive and can feel a lot of guilt themselves in administering consequences. Excuse me. So you want to be able to choose a consequence that the parent is not going to have a lot of shame and guilt around. Otherwise, again, they might end up unknowingly sabotaging things just because they are so uncomfortable giving their child a consequence and thinking that it's too harsh. So in the beginning, maybe you pick a milder consequence, something that the parent is not going to regret giving the child. So with any kind of consequence, I think the real thing to keep in mind here is that during the school day, the parents need to do whatever is necessary to make staying at home less pleasurable and less comfortable for the child than being at school. And I think the consequences are really a good way to tip the scales here. Again, not that we're necessarily going to make being at school fully comfortable for the child, but we just have to make it that much more comfortable than being at home. Okay, so now in terms of how to actually administer consequences, because people are not always comfortable with this part as well, which can actually get in the way of initiating the consequence in the first place. So first, you really want to balance the firmness with the sensitivity. And what I mean by that is that we want to be clear that this is a measure that we're going to need to take, but we don't want to be brash or unempathic about it. Being united also helps. It's simple to do, but sometimes people don't appreciate its value. I've seen that it can be a lot easier to administer a consequence and more effective too, when a parent can be unified and deliver the message in the presence of the other parent or another adult who will be a support around this intervention. By doing so, this will also let the child know that there is no wiggle room here. And then from there, when delivering the actual message, we want to provide the child with some clarity in advance, prior to actually implementing the consequence, about what will happen if he or she does not attend school. We don't want to just have them wake up one day and say, surprise, you don't get to use your cell phone today. We want to let them know in advance what we're doing. And I do believe that if a child knows what consequences to expect in advance and can then have a new opportunity to regain their privileges on a daily basis by going to school or going to class, then he or she is going to be much more likely to respond positively to them. Next, we can certainly listen to objections about the consequence from the child, because we know they're almost always going to object. But from there, we really don't want to waver. We want to hear what they have to say, so that we can then let them know that we fully heard them. But then from there, we really need to stick to the original plan and the original decision about this. And I can appreciate that this isn't always the easiest thing to do sometimes, which is also why I wanted to make it a point to bring it up here. So just a specific example of a consequence that a parent could say to their child that I think comes across as very appropriate is, we really don't want to have to implement this consequence of taking away your cell phone tomorrow. And the good news is that we won't need to do this as long as you go to school. But if we do need to do it, please understand that we really are going to follow through on it first thing in the morning. So you're essentially saying, this is not something that is fun for us to do. It's not something that we want to do. And you, the child, are really in control of this. And if you just go to school, then guess what? This is something that we never have to do. And in the unfortunate event that we do have to do it, you can't say you didn't know it was coming. So here are some basic examples of consequences. And don't take this as hard and fast rules about which ones to use or which not to use. This is just my general experience about what I found to be effective. Because when I ask myself about the 5 M's, the ones listed here on the slide as more effective frequently tend to fit that criteria. These days, technology seems to be the most common one, and it's a pretty easy one too. And for most children and adolescents these days, that's something that's going to be very meaningful to them. The monitoring part here, sometimes that can get a little dicey, But if you're working with the parents about how they can maybe remove the internet service or take away the phone or something of that nature, then it becomes a little easier. Video games can be a good one as well. Social activities is next, and again, that really depends on the child. But if they have a social activity that is happening in the very near future, not something that's happening weeks from now, but something like going to the mall or to the diner for a bite to eat with friends after school that day, I think that can be an effective consequence. It's maybe not quite as measurable as technology, depending on the situation. But of course, if you know your child is at home, then obviously they can't be out at the diner at the same time. And I would say some of the less effective ones for school refusal are something like an indefinite grounding. And I've heard a parent say to a child, in a very well-meaning way, "You're grounded until further notice," which that's not something that is usually going to motivate the child to get to school on a Tuesday if you've done that on a Monday. They're just going to think, well, there's no point in going to school at this point. I have no idea how long I'm grounded. I'll just kind of keep hanging around at home, and at some point, my parents will cave on this one. Withholding allowance. Some people might say this could be effective, but a lot of times when we think about the 5 M's, I think the part about this being maintainable may not always be so easy. Almost inevitably, the child will say that they need money for something, and then the parents may feel guilty and compelled to shell out a few dollars for them. And then by doing so, it really undermines the message they were trying to send with the consequence. Okay, another food consequence here, no dinner out with the family. Sometimes a parent will say, you can't go to your favorite restaurant with us tonight. And on the one hand, it does send the message that the child doesn't get exactly what he wants. But on the other hand, it takes away a child's chance to connect with the family and keeps them at home, which is not something that we typically want to foster. And then the one I alluded to earlier about the TV. Unless you have a really big, strong person that's going to take it with them and put it in their car each day and each time that the child is absent, I don't think that's the kind of workout that a parent really wants. But anyway, on a more serious note, you really just want to ask yourself, whatever consequence it is that you're using, does it meet all of the criteria for the 5 M's? And I think if you're going along on that track, you'll find a consequence that's suitable for you to use. Okay, now we get to what I call the school-driven consequences. Excuse me. And I would say these fall more into the category of natural consequences as a result of the school's policies and procedures. And these consequences are typically going to be administered by school personnel, and more specifically, usually by the school administration. And I should note, in some cases, schools can actually have their own feelings about administering consequences as well. But I would contend that if the school is using consequences in tandem with the family, this truly shows a united front to the child. And also at times, the parents actually need to know that the school is using consequences for their own benefit as a means to appreciate the seriousness of the issue. So here are some examples, and again, this might vary from school to school, but when I've seen schools enact these consequences, I've seen higher success rates related to school refusal, as well as in having fewer chronic issues with these students over the course of their time in school. So one of the first school-driven consequences would be attendance committee meetings. So if your school district does not do attendance committee meetings, that would be something that I would recommend. And they should have a cross-section of school personnel to be a part of this committee. Everyone from administration, guidance, faculty, nurse, and CST, as a means to make sure that the child's attendance issues are not somehow slipping through the cracks. And then from there, you should let the parents and the child know that the child's absences or tardies will be discussed at an upcoming attendance meeting. Not punitively, not as a threat, just as a reality, and that the school needs to monitor and follow the students' attendance issues, and that the meetings will be conducted on a regular basis. And again, just by sharing that information sometimes, it just does convey another level of seriousness. Not to mention, I think it shows some accountability on the school's part. So even if the child and family don't necessarily like it, I would think on a deeper level, they'll appreciate that you recognize the gravity of the situation here. Another way to do that is through attendance letters. I think a lot of times, particularly with the fragile, emotional, school refusal type of child, I think school districts might be a little less inclined to do these, because they'll think, well, this issue is being handled therapeutically, so it's not necessary to deal with an attendance issue. Whereas with the behavioral type, I think schools may feel more compelled to do these attendance letters, because in these situations, the issue is not always being handled therapeutically. But But I would suggest that the administration or whatever arm of your school district sends out attendance letters does them for the special ed SRB children with the emotional issues as well as the behavioral SRB children, because you do want to have a record of this for all students. Again, the letters don't necessarily have to be threatening, but just letting the family know how many absences and tardies the child has, what the school policy is, any accommodations that might be made, but that you are going to follow through with these letters, and then let them know what the steps are going to be along the process. I also think it helps the school district at times in those rare instances of potential legal situations as a kind of CYA as well, to protect against claims being made that the school is not following their own policies and procedures. And then the last piece from an attendance perspective is what I'll call an attendance appeal hearing. And these are typically done at the end of the school year. So even if the child is getting to school or class more regularly as the year goes on, and you're sensing there is more of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back now, if the child has exceeded the absences policy, particularly in a significant way, you do want to make sure that the child and family are continuing to go through all the motions in accounting for these absences, whether that's doctor's notes, psychiatrist notes, medical reasons, or even if they're unexcused. So if the school is doing everything by the books, it's really placing a level of accountability on all parties, including the school itself. This next one here is your extracurricular activity limitation. With this one, I'm sure people may be rolling their eyes out there about whether or not this is a good idea. And you know what? That's a fair point. And I would say this should be handled on a case-by-case basis, based upon whether the extracurricular activity can be potentially helpful in reintegrating the child into the school environment. But I think in situations where a child is doing full-day refusal and not really responding to therapeutic interventions, but then the homecoming dance rolls around, or prom, or some other activity that they want to participate in, like a coffee house or something, and they just want to show up to that and feel like everything is okay now, then I don't think we're necessarily sending the right message to say that the child can participate in these things that they want to do, but then don't have to participate in the academic or the attendance piece. Now again, that's for the school to weigh the pros and cons, but this limitation could be another means to ensure some level of a school-driven consequence. And another one here is loss of credit, which we know can sometimes lead to summer school. This one's pretty obvious and doesn't need much explanation other than to say that I know sometimes schools can feel badly about the consequences, and of course no one likes to see a child lose credit. But I do think though that if you follow the earlier attendance-related consequences that I mentioned, you then may feel more compelled to implement this one, because you may see it as a logical and appropriate outcome related to their high absenteeism. Next, participation in county-based truancy programs. This would be typically initiated by either the child study team or oftentimes through school administration. A lot of my background was in working in Bergen County, where they had their own version of a truancy-based program through the Juvenile Family Crisis Unit. And by the school deciding to get this unit involved, it just is upping the ante of the seriousness of this situation. Again, this is not something you want to do right off the bat. But when you're finding the earlier levels of intervention aren't working, or if you have a behaviorally based school refusal child, you might need to go to the truancy level, which on the one hand can provide some additional support while also having some real legal ramifications. I'll also point out that some school districts have their own truancy officer, and that can be done as an interim step before you start going to these county-based truancy programs. Because also, once you get to the level of the county-based truancy programs, sometimes that can entail taking the parents and the child to court. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the parents haven't necessarily been trying to work with you when you're taking them to court, but it just means that we need to keep taking things more seriously, keep intervening and trying all these steps. And again, I would use this one with caution as a last resort. But in some situations, particularly in the rare ones where the parents aren't fully cooperating with you, or if the child is overtly resistant to absolutely every effort, that's when we might need to go the legal route. And I've even apologized to parents to some degree and will say, listen, it's not necessarily a reflection of the work that you're doing with your child, but with all of our collective efforts together, the child is not buying in or understanding the nature of the situation. And actually one time, I even did have a case where the child in a very empathic way actually surprised me and said, I don't want my parents to have to go to court for my absences, and it did facilitate the child getting to school a little more regularly. So just a little bit more about consequences, kind of big picture here. As we said before, schools and families can both be apprehensive about implementing consequences. And if you're finding that, regardless of who you are in the webinar, if you're finding that the parties involved in school refusal are not on the same page about implementing consequences, once that's happening, it really signals to us that we need to evaluate the existing systems and structures in place. Sometimes it might be one parent that's open to consequences, but not the other parent. And that can play out similarly in the school as well. I've seen situations where some of the school personnel want to move very quickly in using consequences, whereas other personnel are not wanting to use consequences. And the family can actually pick up on the school's ambivalence going on in the process. So it's not for me to tell you exactly what you should or shouldn't do, but I think that the most important thing is that everybody's on the same page here. Otherwise, the child is going to pick up on that too, and they're going to find a way to put a wedge in between all the people involved. Excuse me, my voice a little bit here. Another thing to think about when we do employ consequences is that the child's response and reaction to them can actually provide us with a critical indicator of the child's possible need for more intensive psychiatric care than initially understood. So if we're walking on eggshells about implementing consequences because we're worried about the child's suicidality or safety, then we've got a bigger issue right now. We need to wonder, how psychiatric is this child? If they're going to start verbalizing suicidal ideations related to getting their phone taken away, then we do need to reevaluate the situation. Of course, the reality is, though, that the child's not supposed to have a joyful reaction to receiving a consequence. So, although nobody likes to see children suffer, if they're reacting in an unpleasant way, but it's not an unsafe, unpleasant way, it might actually be a job well done. It tells us that we've actually employed something meaningful to the child, and by doing so, it can hopefully empower them to take action to avoid these situations moving forward. So another point I'll make about this on a related note here is that the child's current situation will only continue to deteriorate in the absence of interventions, consequences, and a clear message. And something I like to say to reframe it for people is that consequences and caring are not mutually exclusive. They're actually complementary. They actually do go together. And sometimes I'll say to a parent, or I'll say to a child on behalf of a parent, it would be much easier to do nothing or to do the same thing over and over again. But we really care too much to let this pattern continue. So we're going to have to try something else at this point. And even if they don't like the message, we hope that at least on some level, they'll understand that we're operating from a sense of caring about it. All right, switching gears now. So I know people seem to like case examples, and I do as well. So with this case example about a day in the life of SRB, it's not about one particular child per se, but it's kind of an amalgamation of a school refusal case in terms of what you might experience during the course of a day. So as a former in-district therapist, this is going through it from my perspective, and of course, other school personnel may often have to deal with it as well. As you can see here, this slide gives some detail by breaking the school day down chronologically, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'll just highlight a few of the areas. So when we get to 8:05 a.m., we have what I call this box of chocolates moment. And I call it the box of chocolates moment because in these situations, when I call the home, I'm not really sure what I'm going to get. Sometimes I speak with the parent and they seem much calmer and tell me the child is ready to head out the door, and I can feel the sense of relief. And at other times, the parent is having a meltdown, and they're really anxious themselves, and I'm just trying to be a support to them. And at other times, the parent or child could be on the phone talking with me, while simultaneously yelling at the other one, and we're having this disjointed three-way conversation. So in some instances where I have the child's cell phone number and have a relationship with them, I try to make a direct call to the child first, which can sometimes mitigate these situations and foster some positive communication to come up with a plan for school. So a little later here, around 10:45, the child has already made it to school for a little while, although not to class yet, and he ends up back in my office, begging and pleading that he needs to go home. I'm now trying to soothe him with my best therapeutic efforts, but not feeling very effective at all. This continues for a little while, and I just keep trying to help the child tolerate his feelings about being at school. And like I said earlier, as long as we can maintain the child at school, I believe that we're making some degree of progress and likely reducing his overall anxiety in the grand scheme of things. And then later on here, it gets to be about 2:15 p.m., and the child has become somewhat integrated at school and survived a couple of classes as the day has moved on. But now he's back in my office in a moderate level of distress. He's saying that he can't go to his last class because the teacher hates him and is always giving him dirty looks. So as the day's starting to come to a close, I decided it makes sense to let him stay with me. You know, we process his perception about the mean teacher, the school day on the whole, and also his effort and capacity to actually handle more than he thought he could. bell eventually rings and the school day ends. So for any of us that have been in these situations, an entire day like this can be kind of exhausting and yet also invigorating, which incidentally may also be a parallel process about how it feels to listen to this webinar about school refusal. Okay, so as I'm sure we can all really appreciate by now, these school refusal situations can be quite complex and as a result at times can be confusing in determining the roles and responsibilities for the people involved. I've tried to touch on them to some extent throughout this webinar, realizing that each school district is going to use their school personnel differently when intervening with SRB. That being said, with this slide here, I wanted to at least provide a general summary of the common roles for the child, family, school personnel, and providers in SRB situations. So for the parents, their main job is really to be in communication with the school on a daily basis when SRB is manifesting. And for the child, their main role, of course, is to be at school and to try and participate in some capacity in an increasingly incremental way. And for the various professionals working at or with the school, you can see the multiple roles that they might need to fill on any given day or situation. So to use a cheesy sports analogy here, it's like everyone at the district is on the same basketball team, and at times one person might be asked to shoot the ball, another may be asked to pass it, someone else might need to play defense at times, or possibly even sit on the bench and be an observing supporter. But I think the biggest piece, though, is for everyone's role to be clearly defined for each situation and to at least make an effort to coordinate and all move in the same direction. So now that I've shared a little bit about my involvement as an in-district therapist from that previous case example, at this point I want to talk a little bit about the SAGE Day in-district programs in general. And like I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, what they're designed to do is fill the gap in service between traditional in-school support and an out-of-district placement. Additionally, when we can use our therapeutic relationship and provide ongoing counseling, the students can then begin to gain the support, strategies, and insight they need in order to make progress in school and to better manage their emotional lives. So we often get the question, what are the in-district services that SAGE Day provides in the public schools? And typically, it's individual counseling, and in most school districts, it's twice weekly, and it can be more often as needed, particularly in crisis situations. We also provide weekly group counseling, which can be in the form of a process group or possibly a social skills group, depending on the needs of the district. And also weekly family counseling for those families that are interested in participating at a greater level. So we're getting all three modalities of counseling in at the in-district level as well. Also, offering consultation support for the school personnel. Of course, there are good, capable school personnel on site, but we might have a different perspective on an issue based on our own clinical experience from being in a similar situation, in terms of what interventions might make sense to employ that haven't been used yet. Or a teacher might seek us out to deal with a classroom situation that has a more complex emotional or behavioral component to it. So we do have these ongoing dialogues with the school personnel that can hopefully be helpful for everyone involved. Again, there's also coordination of care. You'll see that when you look at the details in the day in the life of school refusal, we're coordinating with the internal people at the school and all the external people on the outside, whether it's therapists, psychiatrists, or any other providers involved. And we can really be a point person to bring it all together. We also do classroom and lunchroom observations as a means to give some feedback about how the child is doing in another environment outside of our counseling office. As I said before, home visits. That's an area in which we can really be a presence because we know how busy school personnel can be in handling many other responsibilities. But of course, the home visits can be a really important part of the job that also needs to be done, especially for SRB situations. And based on all of these services above, we also provide the district with quarterly student summaries and year-end program summaries, which can provide some documentation about the work that's being done, both on a clinical case-by-case basis, as well as programmatically on the whole. And lastly, we've done in-service presentations, and we continue to do them as well. Each school district is going to have their own needs about what specific language that we can provide to them, about what specific knowledge we can provide to them, whether it's about school refusal, anxiety, depression, oppositional defiance. It's just some general psychoeducation for the staff. And with this slide here, you can see the school districts where we currently have in-district programs at this point. I think we started to have some nice positive stories with them, and it's been a great partnership for us so far, in which we've really been able to work well with these school districts. And you can also see at this point, we're working with both the high school and middle school levels for these in-district programs. And some of them actually, I'll just say too, initially started as just a high school or just a middle school program. And based on some of these opportunities, we've actually rolled them out and expanded them to serve another segment of the school district's population. Okay, so we're now at the point where we want to get into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you haven't already typed a question in the chat box, feel free to do so now. Okay, so question 1 here from a case manager. It said, we've been working with a school refusal student in a public school setting and have had a hard time getting him to school for the past couple of months. When should we consider an out-of-district placement? Well, that's a good question, because I think sometimes people can jump the gun and sometimes people can wait too long. Obviously, we want to make sure we're going through all the interventions that we talked about here in this webinar. And if you've done the one about the partial hospitalization program, I always wonder how successful a kid's doing at a partial hospital, because sometimes that's a pretty good indicator of how they might do it in an out-of-district setting. So if they're showing up to that every day and showing up on time, there's a good chance that they might do the same at an out-of-district setting. The other piece is, can the public school provide a smaller, less overwhelming environment? Do they have a separate classroom or a separate area where the child can feel like they're sort of out of district without having to be out of district? And if they're not able to provide those things, you might want to consider out of district as well. But again, sometimes we don't want to pull the trigger too early, because if we don't know the real reason why the child is not going to school, I've seen situations where someone sent a kid out of district and then they were just refusing to go to school there too. And that's even worse situation, because it's harder to do the home visits. It's harder to really have that connection with them because they're obviously further away at that point. Okay, so next question. Does SAGE have an SRB team that will come out to the home to bring the child to the school? Well, I guess the short answer is yes. The team would be this. We have this in-district therapist, and because much of our job is really dealing with the clinical caseload, we build time in to make sure that we are going out to the home. When I was working in my in-district job, I can tell you over the course of a school year, with all the different school refusal cases that I had on my caseload, I maybe went out to the home about 30 times during the course of the school year for a few different children. Obviously school districts are different sizes and may have a need or not that need to go out that often, but I think that's one of the things that we can really do that, again, I think other people just don't quite have the time to do. And to us, that's a really big piece of the job. And, we have a certain comfort level going out to the home too, because I know that can be an uncomfortable piece for some people to do as well. Okay, another question here. How do we print the slides? Well, good question. The recording and the slides will be available on our website as early as tomorrow morning. So if you do that, you'll certainly be able to get the slides there. Okay, another good question coming in here, which says, what is PRN medication? And really what that translated into is PRN really means as needed. So again, it's just not something that is specifically scheduled to take each day. The PRN is really at the times when you're feeling that highest level of anxiety, whereas just even if you're taking some baseline level of medication, it might not feel like that's really quite enough. So the PRN, that can be just that extra medication in these certain circumstances where the intensity of the feeling feels over the top. Okay, we have another question here from a guidance counselor, which is a parent of a school refusal student is telling me that the district is responsible for getting him to school and is not willing to get involved themselves. What should I do? That's a good question too. I'd say for the most part, I find that parents are very agreeable to work with us, but obviously occasionally it happens that they're not. The first thing I try to do is reach out to the parent and get a sense from them about why they're not wanting to be involved. Usually if there is any kind of defiance from the parents about not wanting to be involved, usually underneath it, in much the way it is with the school refusal child, there's a lot of anxiety there, or some shame and embarrassment. So I think they're just feeling probably overwhelmed themselves, and they've tried so much and they're feeling so worn out. But what I like to say to parents, and this is something I learned when I was a family therapist, is to really, enlist the parents and say, listen, you're the expert on your child. We really need your help. We can do so much without you, and we'll do our best without you. But if we really want to have the best results, you're the best person that can help us out with that. And if they know we're really on the same team, and this is not a situation where it's school versus parent, I think sometimes that can really bridge the gap. But occasionally, you're not going to have a parent that's on board. And if that's the case, the school just has to do the best they can. And unfortunately, that's how it goes. Okay, another question here. If a child is awaiting placement for behavioral or psychological school refusal issues and will not engage with a home instructor or home instruction, can a district involve a truancy officer to address the child's refusal to engage with the instructor? I haven't really dealt with a situation like that related to home instruction, but I guess in theory, that would be handled, I think, on a school-by-school basis. If they're not engaging in the home instruction, then my concern is that we're really dealing with someone that's pretty low level psychiatrically, and I think I'd really want to approach that from a psychiatric perspective. But again, if it's more of the behavioral type and they're really refusing, at that point, maybe you would want to get a truancy officer involved, even if it's at the home instruction level. So that's a good question, not one that I've really had to deal with before. Okay, another question here. What do you suggest for students who are presenting SRB in the form of work refusal? Yeah, I know. We do see that one a lot too. And that is, when we were talking about form and function earlier, that is just another way that the SRB does manifest. Again, if I'm the in-district therapist working with the child, it's certainly something I'm going to explore with them to find out more about why they're refusing work. Another thing we want to assess too is, again, what purpose is it serving? What is the function of that work refusal? And again, too, if the child is classified, you might have a little bit different way to handle it. Talking with the special ed teachers, if we don't really know what the reason is behind the work refusal, if it's something that they really just don't understand what they're doing, but they're not able to say they don't understand it, we might just want to try to modify their assignments. But on other situations, if there's work refusal, and this is a good question that you asked too, because sometimes the most appropriate thing to do is to, and this might sound a little harsh, is sometimes to give them a 0 for the work. And again, that's sort of a natural consequence of it. And I know, no one likes to fail students or give them 0s, but by the same time, if we enable the work refusal, I think we're giving them the sense that it's okay to not do work. So, the last piece I'll say is, maybe you just want to break down the amount of work that you're giving them into a much more, I'll say, more smaller components, and maybe that will work. But again, if it doesn't, I would consider some of the other things that I just suggested. Okay, big obstacle many families have with outside agencies providing service is within the home. That is, excuse me, I'm having a little difficulty reading the question here. Oh, big obstacle many families have with outside agencies providing the home is this: someone is oppositional. Any suggestions for getting agencies and the family on board? Well, the oppositional ones, those are really tough, and I think sometimes in those situations too, with the different agencies, sometimes things might need to go a legal route, because there is a lot of times this push and pull with this oppositionality. You would hope that, if you can go into the home and do something like that, that might be another way to deal with it. But again, there are also outside agencies too, like the CMO, care management organizations, that can help facilitate getting some in-home therapy involved. But when you have different levels of oppositionality, you really need to assess what can be done. And if there's a real oppositionality too, that can be a manifestation of some form of a real underlying depression too. And if depression is not always in the form of sadness, it can be anger and irritability, particularly in males. So if they're really, really unengaged with that level of service, you might want to think about some other alternatives and higher levels of care. Inpatient is obviously the higher level of care. And sometimes you just want to let kids know what's going to happen if they don't engage, if they don't participate in that level of care. because if you let them know what the next step is, sometimes that might be a way to get them engaged. Okay. Another question is here: how do you handle non-compliant questions? And this is going to be the last question for the webinar. And excuse me, how do you handle the non-compliant parents here? And that's coming from a school counselor as well. And you know, I talked about that just a little bit earlier in terms of these non-compliant parents, but you know, again, it depends on what the nature of their non-compliance is. You know, sometimes if they're just not responding to calls, frankly, you know, you could do a home visit with them as well. But if they're actually actively telling you that they're not going to be compliant, that's a different issue. And like I talked about earlier, you know, in the rare situations, if they're really non-compliant, that is a situation where you might need to talk about the idea of taking them to court. Depending on how psychiatric the child is, if they're not compliant, then you get that slippery slope of child protective. Again, that's an ultra rare situation, but you know, we need to help the parents feel like it's important that they're involved, and a lot of times that can be done through some positive discussions. But you know, parents, sometimes the school has to use consequences for parents too. You know, typically that's not the case, but that is for those rare situations. Okay, again, that was the last question, and unfortunately, we've actually run out of time for today. I do want to thank everyone for once again participating in our webinar. And if we were unable to get to your questions, please submit them to yadler1@sageday.com. That's yadler1@sageday.com by the end of today, and we will respond to them as soon as we can. And you can see that there on the screen. And please also keep an eye out for an email from GoToWebinar that should arrive in your inbox tomorrow, containing a survey link which will direct you to your certificate of completion containing your CEU. And additionally, if for any reason you do not receive an email from GoToWebinar tomorrow, or you did not individually register for the webinar but participated in it by viewing it on someone else's computer, we will also be making the link available on our Sage Day Schools Facebook page. So the link will be there as well. Thanks again, everybody, and have a nice day.